How's it going, everyone? Welcome to another video. Today we're making something really special, brioche cruffins. They'll be filled with mango curd, topped with lime whipped cream and toasted coconuts. Some real nice Asian flavors in there. The best part is that you can customize it. You can use your favorite filling and your favorite topping. In fact, the mango curd recipe that I'm going to show you can be made with any other fruit. But you gotta admit, the mango looks pretty good, right? This must be one of the most delicious things I've ever made. And if you're up for it and you follow my instructions, you'll also be able to make this. So let's get to it and see what we need. Starting with the equipment, we'll need a bowl, scales, a dough scraper, a temperature probe, a whisk, a spatula, a couple of nozzles for piping, something to cut the dough with. A pizza cutter is perfect for this, but if you don't have one, use a knife. We'll need a couple of piping bags for the filling and the topping, and a mold to bake them in. You can use a muffin tin, but I have these individual molds. They work really well. There's a couple more things we need. We'll need a pot for cooking our curd in. We'll need another bowl or two. Also need a rolling pin for rolling the dough out. A fine grater for the lime zest. And a ruler for precision. We'll also need a couple sheets of baking paper. And really important in this recipe, we will need a mixer. Now on to the ingredients. For the mango curd, we'll need a couple of eggs, some sugar, mango puree, some cold cubed butter, cornstarch and lime juice. For the lime flavored whipped cream, we'll need some double cream, some powdered sugar and a bit of lime zest. For garnish, we'll use some toasted coconut flakes and some more lime zest. And we'll also need more butter for laminating the dough with. And we might as well start by getting it into shape. This is the butter that will go in between the layers of the brioche dough. And we need to form it into a nice flat 15 cm square. That's where we're going to use the parchment paper, the ruler and the rolling pin. Simply lay down the two pieces of parchment paper on top of each other, fold one side over and then measure 15 centimeters from the fold to the opposite side and fold that over. So you want to end up with 15 centimeters between the folds. The size of the parchment paper doesn't really matter, as long as it can accommodate a 15 centimeter square in the middle. So you want to turn the paper and repeat the same steps on the open sides. As you can see, we ended up with a nice square. This is by far the best and most convenient method for shaping the butter that I've found so far. So remove the top piece of the parchment paper and fill up the square with slices of butter. There's no need to be precise here, just lay it down more or less evenly. Now take the other piece of parchment paper, lay it on top of the butter, and now fold it up following the lines that we created earlier. You can see where this is going, right? All we need to do is seal it in, turn it upside down, and using the rolling pin, press it into shape. Start by pressing it, and then continue on with rolling. But don't be too rough on it, otherwise you may squeeze out the corner. And this is what you'll end up with, a nice square. Now pop it in the fridge, where you can continue on with the brioche dough. And for that, we'll need some strong white bread flour, eggs, butter, yeast, salt, sugar, and a little bit of water. Now I always say how important it is to have your ingredients at the right temperature. And it could not be more important when it comes to brioche. This dough will take around 25 minutes of mixing time. So all your ingredients need to be stone cold. As you can see, the eggs are at 4 degrees. The flour, I actually put that in the freezer. That's at 0 or less. Even the butter must be cold. Of course, it will be quite difficult to add cold butter to a dough. So we need to make it pliable. So use a large piece of parchment paper and press the butter out until it's flat with a rolling pin. This will ensure that it's soft, but it's still cold. And I cannot stress this enough. All your ingredients must be cold. There's no way around it. If they're not, you will fail. And so that this butter doesn't warm up, I'm going to flatten it out, put it back on my plate and stick it in the fridge until I need it. And last but not least, I have refrigerated the mixing bowl and actually kept a dough hook in the freezer all day long. Preparation is key, and now we are ready to make the dough. So in your mixing bowl, add the water, the salt, the yeast, the sugar, follow that with the eggs and the flour. I know normally when we make a dough, I advise mixing all the other ingredients before adding the flour. When you're using a mixer, it doesn't really matter. So I'm going to switch it on second speed, which is basically low speed on my mixer, and I'm going to mix the dough for 10 minutes. The initial 10 minutes of mixing are there for building up gluten and strength in the dough before we start adding the butter to it. Now your mixer may be different. You may have different speed settings, a smaller bowl perhaps, but I reckon 10 minutes on low speed in any mixer will be just about right. And it has been around 10 minutes. I'm going to switch it off, and as you can see, I pull on the dough. It's resisting nicely, it's nice and strong. Now we can switch it back on, still on the same speed, and start adding the butter in chunks. Just throw it in as the dough is mixing. The dough will need to mix for around 5 minutes after the addition of butter. And if you have a wide mixing bowl like I do, and your mixer is struggling to pick up the dough, simply stop it, lower the bowl, and using your scraper, scrape down the sides. Now this mixing bowl is on the large side. You may not have to do this. Once you scraped it all up, switch it back on, still on the same speed. We are still on the second mixing phase, which is 5 minutes. And this is basically there to incorporate the butter into the dough. Because once the butter disappears around 5 minutes later, we can switch the mixer on a higher speed. It's number 4 on my mixer, which is about medium. And from here on in, we need to mix for 10 more minutes. And once again, if the dough is sticking to the sides, stop the mixer and scrape it together. Now this final mixing stage on the higher speed is there to really work the dough and get the gluten going. But we're not going to mix the whole 10 minutes on high speed, because that would be too much. You only want to keep mixing it on this higher speed until the dough starts collecting in the middle and stops sticking to the bowl, to the sides and to the bottom. Which in my case was around 7 minutes in. So for the final 3 minutes, I'm turning the speed back down to number 2. And as you can see, the dough is right on the hook. It's not sticking to the bowl anymore. Now if your mixing bowl is smaller, this may take less time for you. But here it took 25 minutes in total. 10 minutes initial mix, 5 minutes when adding the butter, and 10 minutes final mixing. And this is looking pretty good. Now this dough is a little bit sticky, so you want to handle it with wet hands. And shape it into a nice ball before you place it in your bowl. What I like to do is fold the sides under and into the middle. But don't make it too tight, you don't want to tear the surface. Now let's take the temperature of this dough. 25 to 26 degrees Celsius, just about right for this. Now we can cover it up and pop it in the fridge for 1 hour. And after an hour of chilling, we need to give it a fold. Now there's 2 main reasons why we're folding this dough. First of all, we want to chill the dough down evenly. And naturally the outside will cool down first before the middle does. So by folding, we'll distribute that temperature evenly throughout the dough. Secondly, this dough is quite stretchy, so we want to build up some tension in it. And the folds will do just that. Now all you want to do is stretch the dough out, then fold the edge over the middle, going around in a circle, till you have a nice tight ball. Then you can flip it smooth side up again, tighten it against the table, and back in the bowl it goes. And we'll need to chill it down for 1 more hour. And feel free to use a little bit of flour if you feel it's sticking, but do not use too much. It's always easier to add than to take off. Now back in the fridge it goes for 1 more hour. And after the second hour of chilling, we can divide the dough. The reason for dividing this dough is that for this project, we'll only be using half of it. So all the other ingredients that are written down below are enough for half of this dough. The reason for making a big piece of dough like this is that, for instance, my mixer has a very large bowl and it would not be able to mix a small piece of dough. But of course I just could make double the amount of whatever we're making. The thing is that brioche is the most versatile dough of all. And there are so many things you can make out of it. So I'm going to use half for this project and half for another. And if you check out my brioche playlist, you'll find plenty of ideas there. So unless you have a small mixer, then I would suggest doing the same thing that I did here. Make the whole recipe, then divide it in half, use one for this project and one for the other. So after dividing it, shape it into balls, use the same method that we used earlier for folding the dough. Now we can wrap it up in cling film. Don't wrap it too tight because the dough will expand. The main thing here is to cover the dough so it doesn't dry out in the fridge. And now it's ready for a long cold proof. And you can leave it in the fridge for up to 24 hours. So I'll put these babies to sleep and I'll see you tomorrow. Right, it's been around 16 hours actually. The dough is puffed up nicely. Here's our butter square that we made earlier. Now we can start the lamination process, turning this brioche dough into brioche croissant dough. And there are some things to note here. The butter must be at the right consistency. It should be cold, but flexible. If it's brittle, then that means it's too cold. You can simply leave it out on the side whilst you're rolling the dough out. because if the butter is too hard, it will break up inside the dough. You won't get a nice lamination. Now give your dough ball a generous dusting of flour and then start pressing it out by hand. We want to end up with a nice square of dough, which will fit the butter square inside it. Once you pressed it by hand a little bit, continue on with a rolling pin. But don't go too far. Once in a while, grab the butter and measure it against the dough. See, I could have even rolled it a little bit smaller. But it's not the end of the world. Just make sure everything is nice and square, and then place the butter on the dough so that the points of the butter are in between the points of the dough. Here's the best way to do it. Place it butter side down and simply peel off the paper. And after this, we need to seal it in. So take the corners of the dough and fold them into the middle of the butter. Try not to trap any air inside it. That sometimes causes issues when we come to roll it out. But once you sealed in your butter, press the seams shut, then dust your dough with flour, and we're gonna roll it out. You can start off by pressing it by hand, then pressing it with your rolling pin. You don't have to be super aggressive, just do it nice and gradually. See what I meant about the butter earlier? If you did this and the butter was hard, it would break up inside the dough. But if the butter is nice and pliable, like it was in my case, it will simply get squished, and that's exactly what we want. Now roll the dough until it's about 2.5 to 3 times its length. There's no need to measure anything here. Just try and make it nice and straight. So now we are going to do the first fold. Visually divide the dough into 4. You want to fold one side, right into the middle, brush off any excess flour, and then fold the opposite side to meet the first one in the middle. Then you can press it together so it's nice and square. And lastly, we want to fold this in half again, and we have already created quite a few layers. The butter layered between the dough and then fold it up into 4. And after the first fold, we need to chill the dough down. And instead of dusting my dough with flour, I simply clean the table with it. For one, it gets rid of the mess, and it prevents it from sticking. I've prepared a baking tray with some cling film, which I laid across it. I find this to be the most convenient way of handling this dough. Simply lay it down in the middle, wrap it up from all sides, we can stick it in the fridge. We'll leave it to chill for around 30 minutes. If your fridge is running a bit warm, keep it in for longer. And whilst we are waiting for the dough to chill down, we might as well do something useful, right? So let's get on with the topping and the filling. So starting with the lime whipped cream. Grab a large bowl, add the powdered sugar, the lime zest and the double cream. Make sure your double cream is nice and cold. And just whisk it until it becomes nice and thick. Using cold cream really makes this job easy. And 2 minutes later, that's the topping done. Now we can pop it in a bowl and leave it in the fridge for later. Now you may be wondering why we're using icing sugar for this. It's because it contains starch. It'll help the cream keep its shape. So with that out of the way, let's make the curd. In a small pan, combine the sugar, the cornstarch, follow that with the lime juice and the eggs. Now add your fruit puree, which is mango in my case. You can puree fresh fruit, but I could not find fresh mangoes. So I used some tinned stuff, and it was pretty good actually. So the only thing we're not adding at this point is the butter. Now whisk everything up until it's nice and smooth, and bring it over to the stove on medium heat. Cook it and whisk it occasionally until it becomes nice and thick. It took me around 7 minutes, and as soon as the foam from the top disappears, you can feel it being nice and thick, it's ready. This is exactly the texture that you want. Now all that is left to do is to emulsify the butter into the curd. Add half of it first, whisk it until it disappears, and then add the other half, and repeat. As I mentioned earlier, you can make this curd any flavor you want. The base recipe will always be the same. Now we can pour that in a bowl and leave it to chill down. And just look at it, beautifully smooth, shiny. That's a nice filling for our cruffin. Now cover it with cling film, make sure it's touching the surface to prevent the hard skin from forming. Now let's chill it down. And 30 minutes should have passed by now, so we can do the second fold on our dough. But before we do so, let's examine it. You can see there's one open side and 2 open ends and 1 closed side. We need to roll the dough in the direction of the 2 open ends. And don't ask me why, because I can't wrap my head around these layers. But that's just how it is. So dust your dough with flour, start by pressing it with a rolling pin to make it nice and even, and then roll it out. It doesn't have to be super long. Roll it to about twice the length. Just try and keep it nice and straight. Dust off any excess flour, and this time we're going to fold it into 3, not 4. So take 1/3, fold it over, brush off any excess flour. Now take the opposite side and fold it the other way. And try to do it nice and straight. If you need to correct it, correct it. And this is the second and final fold. That's all we need for this dough. Once again, I'm going to clean my table with it. Now wrap it up in the same cling film that we prepared earlier. And we will chill it down for the final time, for another 30 minutes. So as you can see, laminating bread dough is really not that difficult. And with this dough, you can make any number of things. Croissants, fouettés, Danish pastries, all kinds of goodies. But we're making the easiest thing, the cruffin. So all we need to do now is roll it out to a big rectangle. We're gonna have to cut it into strips, and I want each strip to be 4 centimeters wide. So I'm gonna roll the dough until it's a bit longer than 33 centimeters. And to all my friends across the pond, of course I've added the measurements in inches in the recipe. So once you rolled it out to size, make sure it's nice and straight. Now we're gonna grab the pizza cutter and trim it. And you wanna trim only one side, the top and the bottom. And we'll only trim the other side once we have measured everything out. And if you were to use the whole brioche dough and make more cruffins, the method would be the same. You'd just be handling a bigger dough. And of course don't forget, you'd have to measure out double the ingredients for the filling and for the topping. But whatever you decide to do, mark the dough in 4 centimeter increments from the trimmed side, and then finish off by trimming off the excess. Now you should end up with 8 sections. And now using the ruler as a guide, simply slice the dough into strips. And that's how you trim your cruffin. Pretty simple, right? And of course you can use the scraps to make another one. It won't be as pretty, but it'll taste just the same. Now the final shaping could not be easier. Take a strip of dough and simply roll it up. Now you don't have to roll it very tight. Just light pressure from one end to the other. And there you go, that's your cruffin. Now repeat the process and we can get on with the final proof. Of course the size of the cruffin will rely on the size of the baking mold. If you're using molds that are narrower but deeper, then you might want to make your cruffin strips wider but shorter. My molds are quite shallow but wide, so that's the shape I'm using. Now these should be non-stick, but I still brush them with butter, just in case. Now let's clean down the mess, and we can cover these up and leave them for the final proof. And this will totally depend on the temperature of your kitchen, and you really want to let them rise. They should more than double in size. And you can stick them in a warm area to speed up the process, but remember, butter melts. So I wouldn't suggest sticking them in your oven with the light on. Anyhow, it took me around 4 hours, and as you can see they're puffing up beautifully. And during the final hour of fermentation, preheat your oven 160 degrees Celsius with a fan on. And these things have risen beautifully. I'm pretty happy with the way they look. Now we can pop them in the oven. They'll take around 25 to 30 minutes. Of course it depends on your oven. And you can turn the tray around halfway through baking to make sure you get a nice even crust. And look at that rise. I just love the time-lapse baking shots. Now there's a last minute thing I decided to do, is to brush them with hot sugar syrup. It's simply equal parts sugar and water brought up to a boil. And I'm gonna brush the cruffins with it, that'll give them a nice shine and will soften the crust. I prefer my cruffins soft instead of flaky. You know, sometimes you bite into a croissant and just shards explode across the room. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of that. Right, so after letting them sit for 5 minutes in the molds after brushing them with sugar syrup, we can take them out and let them cool down completely. And whilst they're cooling down, we can put our fillings in the piping bags. And to prevent any leaks, what I like to do is twist the piping bag and stick it inside the nozzle. That way nothing will come out the other end as you fill it up. And to use both of your hands and make it easier for yourself, stick the piping bag in a tall cup. And this is in my opinion the easiest and most convenient way of filling up your piping bag with anything. And now repeat with the curd. So you'll let your cruffins chill down for at least an hour before you fill them up. And that is the final step in the process. We need to fill them and top them. And then we need to eat them. This filling is just enough for 8 to 9 cruffins. It will be a generous amount in each cruffin, so jam that piping bag in deep and squeeze hard. Then top it with the cream, finish with a bit of lime zest and the toasted coconut flakes. And then you can admire the beauty for a second before devouring it. And that's how you make brioche cruffins, my friends. So what do you think of this sinful goodness? Is that something you would make? Let me know down in the comments, and if you have any questions or suggestions, also let me know. And check out my other videos. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.